I was recently asked about the pencil lines that I draw on a project before I sand it. The person understood kind of intuitively that it was to make sure that I get coverage, but there's actually more than just making sure I don't miss a spot. It'll also help with things like detecting divots, or if you've got kind of an uneven area that hasn't been sanded enough, rather than just, I've been there with the sandpaper. So I wanted to take a moment and showcase with a little experiment what this does. In section 1, I will be using sandpaper on a relatively flat board just to show you what it normally does. In section 2, I'll do a little divot. I'll use sandpaper again, and you'll see how just sandpaper attached to a sander, how it manages to smooth out those areas. And in section 3, I'll make another divot, and with that I'll use an interface pad, which will showcase how it doesn't make quite as much of an averaging across the high and low points, but does allow you to kind of reach down into those low points and sand them smooth a little easier. So let's get started. As a side note, this is why people tell you you shouldn't use the edge of an orbital sander, or really any sander, to try to get into a spot that's not being sanded, because you will make a little bit of a divot. So just something to keep in mind. Now we'll draw the grid. Because this is an experiment, I'll draw a very right angle grid. Normally I just kind of scribble. Functionally it works all the same, but the straight lines in a grid might illustrate this a little bit better. Now we'll start on the one that doesn't have a divot, and I will show you how quickly it sands up. This is just standard 80 grit paper. It's going to be pretty aggressive, so it'll make quick work of it, but you'll see. Just takes a few passes, no more pencil. Now it's time for section 2. I will go ahead and sand it a few passes and show you that the grid still hangs around, and then I will sand it until it goes away, and you'll see you have to be a little more thorough on your sanding to get through that divot, but that's what the grid's for. It tells you when you're done. And there you have it. So I did about 3-4-ish circle-y passes, and you can see the divot is still there. Still got some of that grid. So I'll get through it real quick. And it took about another 10 or 12 passes to get that out. Now let me grab an interface pad, and I'll show you how that changes things. Now this is the interface pad. It's got the loop part and then the hook part, kind of like a Velcro, with this soft foam core in the middle. Gives it a little compliance. Now I want to make sure I line up the holes so that my dust collection still works. And because this foam has kind of that compliant nature to it, it will not smooth out the averages between the high and low points in my sanding as much, but it will reach down into those low points and kind of finish sanding faster, which may be fine if that's what you need, or maybe you have kind of like a curved or rounded surface. These come in really handy for that. Now one thing I will do with this interface pad, because even though I try to get it as lined up as perfectly as I can, it's never quite perfect and it isn't as balanced as the built-in interface that's on the sander. So I will bring it back a little bit in speed, but you'll see that it'll still sand through things quite quickly because of that compliant nature of the foam. So I'll take it back. Let's go a couple notches. And now we sand. So you can see I did about 3 to 4 passes again. Where the divot is, you can see the sanding marks have gone away. All right, so while that has removed the sanding marks quicker than without the interfacing pad, that divot is still very much there. I can still feel it. To show that, I'm gonna draw on it again, take off the sanding interface pad, sand it real quick, and you'll see those marks are still hanging around. I turned it back up to full speed. We'll make a few passes just to remove the outside edges of those marks, and you'll see the divot is still there. And there you have it. That divot is still very much in the wood. In order to get through that, if I wanted to try to level out those surfaces, I would need to use without the interface pad to get it as flat as possible. You'll never actually get it flat with an orbital sander because I have nothing to reference against. I need a flat surface to reference against. In order to get a true flat, you need a jointer or a planer for the appropriate edge or face of a board. We're not going to use that today. Let's finish this up. And there we go. So that's why I draw a grid whenever I'm sanding a surface. This makes sure I've got it as smooth as possible, not flat, but smooth, and that I'm able to say the surface is ready for the next grit. Now, as far as why you want to make sure your surface is ready for the next grit, if you don't sufficiently sand each grit down smooth, you can end up with deeper scratches from lower grit numbers that then when you go to higher grit numbers, they never actually come out. You may go from like 80 to 150 to 220, maybe even up to 320 if you're going like really smooth, and then you go put your finish on it and you realize, oh, I missed some of those deeper scratches and now they show up. The finish will highlight them very, very deeply. And now you have to take everything back off, which either means cabinet scraper or sander again to get back down through the finish, all the way back up through the grits. And you can save yourself a lot of time to make sure you fully sanded at each level of grit. You can use this with any form of sanding, but most people would use this with an orbital sander because you're getting that random, relatively smooth, relatively flat surface all at once. If you do hand sanding, if you're using like a sanding block that's very flat, you can actually use that to average out those peaks and valleys pretty nicely. It'll just take more time. If you're hand sanding with a loose piece of sandpaper or maybe just stuck to a soft interface pad that you're hand sanding with, you will end up going into those peaks and valleys a lot more, and you won't necessarily get it flat, but you can still get it smooth. And again, if you're using a curved surface, that's perfectly fine. That's what you want. I hope that helps you understand why I do the things I do when I sand. And until next time, be well. I was recently asked about the pencil lines that I draw on my wood, and I sanded this when I shouldn't have. I'm good at this. I'm gonna sand this flat again, make no divot this time. Divot removed. Always turn off your tools first. Turn off the tool. Let's try this again. Good boy. Yeah. Good boy.